Some moments in life don't just change us, they redefine us. Imagine standing at the edge of everything you've ever known, staring down a path that feels impossible to walk. That's where our story begins, with a woman in a wheelchair, a broken promise, and a man who thought he'd lost her forever. But this isn't just about what happens when life knocks you down, it's about how you choose to rise. Stay with us as we take you on a journey of love, resilience, and second chances. If you're ready for a story that will make you laugh, cry, and believe in the power of starting over, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And once you've watched, let us know in the comments, what would you do if life asked you to take one more step? Your thoughts matter, and they might just inspire someone else to keep going too. Some moments in life are meant to change everything, but they don't come with warning bells or flashing lights. Sometimes, all it takes is a split second, a glance out the window, and suddenly, your world tilts on its axis. Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he drove through the quiet streets of their small town. Beside him sat Leo, his 12-year-old son, scrolling absent-mindedly on his phone. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, painting the town in hues of gold and amber. They were heading home after picking up groceries, an ordinary errand that felt like any other day. But then, something caught Jack's eye, a flash of white against the gray stone walls of St. Mary's Church. He slowed down instinctively, his gaze darting toward the scene unfolding near the church steps. There she was, a woman in a wedding dress, sitting alone in a wheelchair. Her head was bowed, delicate hands clutching a bouquet of wilted flowers. Leo leaned forward, squinting at the sight. "Dad," he whispered softly, almost reverently, "she looks like someone who needs us." Jack hesitated for just a moment before pulling over to the curb. His heart pounded strangely in his chest, though he couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was the way she sat there so still, as if the weight of the world had settled onto her shoulders. Or maybe it was the faint sound of her sobs carried by the breeze, barely audible but enough to pierce right through him. He stepped out of the car without saying a word, leaving Leo behind to watch curiously from the passenger seat. As Jack approached, he noticed how the sunlight seemed to cling to her, illuminating the intricate lace of her gown. She looked breathtakingly beautiful, and utterly heartbroken. "Miss?" Jack called gently, his voice low and steady. She lifted her head slowly, revealing tear-streaked cheeks and eyes filled with despair. For a moment, time froze. Jack felt the air leave his lungs. It was her. Grace Harper. His high school sweetheart, the girl he'd once promised forever to, only for life to pull them in opposite directions. Grace blinked, recognition dawning across her face. "Jack," she murmured, her voice trembling. "It's me," he said simply, crouching down beside her wheelchair. Her lips parted as though she wanted to say more, but no words came out. Instead, fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Jack reached out instinctively, brushing one away with his thumb. "What happened here, Grace?" he asked, his tone soft yet firm. She shook her head, trying to compose herself. "He didn't show," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "My fiancé, he left me standing, or rather, sitting, at the altar." Jack clenched his jaw, anger bubbling beneath the surface, not at her, but at whoever could be cruel enough to break her spirit like this. Memories flooded back to him, prom nights, stolen kisses under the bleachers, dreams of a future together that never came to pass. Seeing her now, fragile yet resilient, stirred something deep within him. "You deserve better than this," Jack said firmly, meeting her gaze. Grace let out a shaky laugh, laced with bitterness. "Better? No one wants damaged goods, Jack. I'm not exactly whole anymore." At that, Jack's expression softened further. He placed both hands on the arms of her wheelchair, leaning closer until their faces were level. "You listen to me," he said, his voice unwavering. "You were never broken to me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Grace stared at him, her breath hitching as emotions swirled in her eyes, shock, disbelief, and perhaps even a flicker of hope. In the background, Leo climbed out of the car and stood watching silently, sensing the gravity of the moment. Jack glanced over his shoulder briefly, offering his son a reassuring smile before turning back to Grace. "We're going to fix this," Jack continued, determination etched into every line of his face. "Starting today." And with that, the first chapter of their story began anew, one defined not by loss, but by redemption. The churchyard was quiet now, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Jack remained crouched beside Grace, his hands still resting lightly on her wheelchair. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words, memories neither had dared to revisit until this moment. "I never thought I'd see you again," Grace said finally, her voice soft but tinged with a sadness that cut straight through Jack. "Not like this." Jack swallowed hard, forcing himself to hold her gaze. "I know things didn't end well between us back then, but seeing you here today," he trailed off, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. "It feels like fate or something." Grace let out a small, bitter laugh. "Fate? You think this is fate?" She gestured down at herself, the wheelchair, the crumpled bouquet in her lap. "This isn't some grand storybook ending, Jack. This is just me. Broken. Forgotten." "No," Jack said firmly, cutting her off. "You're not broken, Grace. And you're definitely not forgotten." His eyes searched hers, willing her to believe him. "What happened to you?" For a long moment, she hesitated, staring down at her hands. Then, slowly, she began to speak. "It was an accident, a car crash. 5 years ago. I woke up in the hospital unable to feel my legs. The doctors told me I'd never walk again." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on. "Mark, he couldn't handle it. At first, he stayed, tried to be supportive, but eventually," she paused, blinking back tears. "Eventually, he said he loved me too much to watch me suffer. That's what he called it, suffering. Like I wasn't even worth sticking around for anymore." Jack's jaw tightened. He remembered Mark vividly, tall, charming, always quick with a smile. But now, hearing how he'd abandoned Grace when she needed him most, Jack felt nothing but contempt. "He didn't deserve you," he said bluntly. Grace gave him a weak smile, though there was no joy behind it. "That's kind of you to say, but you don't understand. People look at me differently now. They pity me. Or worse, they avoid me altogether. It's easier to just disappear." Before Jack could respond, Leo appeared beside them, holding out a tissue he'd grabbed from the car. "Here," he said shyly, offering it to Grace. "You shouldn't cry. You're way prettier when you smile." Grace blinked in surprise, then chuckled softly despite herself. "Well, aren't you sweet?" She took the tissue, dabbing at her eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart." Leo grinned, clearly pleased with himself. "I'm Leo, by the way. Jack's kid. And also his unofficial chauffeur since he's terrible at parallel parking." Grace laughed, a real laugh this time, light and genuine, and Jack shot his son a grateful look. "Leave it to Leo to break the tension." "Nice to meet you, Leo," Grace said warmly. "You're quite the charmer." "That's what my mom says," Leo replied matter-of-factly. "Except she usually adds, when you're not eating all the cookies." Grace laughed again, and for a fleeting moment, the weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. Watching her, Jack felt a flicker of hope stir within him. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to mend what had been broken. "So," Jack said after a beat, standing up and brushing imaginary dust from his jeans. "How about dinner? My treat. There's this little diner downtown that makes the best burgers in town." Grace hesitated, glancing between Jack and Leo. "I don't know. Come on, Leo chimed in enthusiastically. We'll tell you embarrassing stories about Dad. Trust me, it's worth it. Grace raised an eyebrow, amused. Embarrassing stories, huh? Oh yeah, Leo nodded solemnly. Like the time he got stuck in a treehouse because he ate too many tacos and couldn't fit back through the trapdoor. Grace burst out laughing, covering her mouth with her hand. Okay, fine. You've convinced me. Jack rolled his eyes good-naturedly but couldn't hide the smile tugging at his lips. Alright, champ, enough selling me out. Let's get going. As they made their way toward the car, Grace lagged behind for a moment, watching Jack and Leo interact. There was an ease between them, a warmth that radiated naturally. It was something she hadn't realized she'd missed until now. Hey, Jack called over his shoulder, noticing she'd fallen behind. You coming? Grace nodded, wheeling herself forward. When she reached him, she stopped and looked up, her expression softening. Thank you, Jack, she murmured quietly. For stopping. For everything. Jack smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Anytime, Grace. Anytime. They stood there for a moment, the silence between them comfortable now, filled with the promise of new beginnings. As they climbed into the car, Grace glanced out the window, her reflection ghost-like against the glass. I'm not used to anyone staying, she whispered so softly that only she could hear. But deep down, a tiny spark of hope ignited, one she hadn't felt in years. The diner was warm and inviting, its neon sign casting a soft glow over the parking lot as they pulled up. Inside, the smell of grilled burgers and freshly baked pie filled the air, mingling with the low hum of conversation and the occasional clink of cutlery against plates. Jack held the door open for Grace, his hand lingering near her shoulder as if to steady her, a gesture that went unnoticed by everyone except Leo, who smirked knowingly from behind them. They settled into a booth by the window, where sunlight streamed through the blinds in golden stripes. Grace sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, glancing around the room with a mix of curiosity and quiet unease. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to feel anything resembling normalcy. So, Leo began eagerly, leaning forward on his elbows. What do you do when you're not getting left at the altar? Grace chuckled softly, appreciating the boy's attempt to lighten the mood. Well, I used to teach dance, she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. Ballet, jazz, contemporary, you name it. But after the accident, she trailed off, shrugging lightly. Let's just say my career took an early retirement. Leo tilted his head, intrigued. Dance must have been fun. Did you ever perform on stage? All the time, Grace replied, her eyes lighting up despite herself. I loved it, the way the music would take hold of me, like nothing else mattered. Every step felt like freedom. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought, transported back to another life entirely. Then, shaking her head slightly, she added, but that was a long time ago. Jack watched her carefully, noting the flicker of pain that crossed her face. He reached across the table, placing a gentle hand over hers. You still have that spark, Grace. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Grace smiled faintly but didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention to Leo, who was fidgeting excitedly in his seat. You know, dancing isn't just about moving your feet, she said. It's about feeling the rhythm in your heart. Want to try something? Leo's eyes widened. Me? Dance? Right here? Why not? Grace grinned mischievously. Close your eyes. Imagine the beat of your favorite song. Now, move however it makes you feel. At first, Leo hesitated, looking self-conscious under the amused gazes of nearby diners. But then, slowly, he started to sway, arms waving awkwardly at first before finding their own rhythm. By the time he opened his eyes, he was grinning ear to ear. That was awesome, he exclaimed, laughing breathlessly. Can we do it again? Grace laughed along with him, the sound warm and genuine. Anytime, kiddo. Dancing is for everyone. As the evening wore on, the three of them fell into easy conversation, sharing stories and laughter like old friends reunited. For Grace, it was a rare moment of connection, one she hadn't realized she'd been craving until now. Over the next few weeks, Jack made it a point to see Grace more often. At first, it was casual, coffee runs, impromptu visits, but soon, their meetings became something deeper. They talked about everything, their pasts, their dreams, the weight of regrets. And while Jack couldn't erase the scars Grace carried, he could offer her something even more precious, a sense of belonging. One afternoon, as they strolled together through the park, Grace paused beside a fountain, her gaze drawn to a group of children practicing ballet on the grass. Her expression softened, a mixture of longing and sorrow etched into her features. "I miss it sometimes," she admitted quietly. "Not just the dancing, but the teaching. Helping kids find their confidence, their joy." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "Have you ever thought about going back? Maybe not performing, but teaching again?" Grace shook her head. Who would want to learn from someone who can't even stand on her own 2 feet? Before Jack could respond, a young man approached them, his posture tense and his jaw clenched tightly. It was Danny, one of Grace's former students, a troubled teenager with sharp edges and a chip on his shoulder. "Hey, Miss Harper," Danny muttered, avoiding eye contact. "Heard about what happened at the church. Tough break." Grace stiffened, her smile faltering. "Danny. What brings you here?" Danny shrugged nonchalantly, though there was a flicker of resentment in his eyes. "Just thought I'd check if you were still playing victim." "Guess I was right." The words hit like a punch to the gut, and Grace flinched visibly. Jack stepped forward instinctively, ready to intervene, but Grace raised a hand to stop him. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice steady despite the hurt simmering beneath the surface. Turning back to Danny, she said, "If you've got something to say, say it." Danny hesitated, then blurted out, "You gave up. You quit teaching because you couldn't handle being imperfect. Do you know how many kids looked up to you? How many of us needed someone like you to show us we could be more than our mistakes?" Grace stared at him, stunned into silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Danny. I never meant to let you down." Danny scowled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Yeah, well, apologies don't fix everything." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Grace standing there, trembling. Later that evening, Leo came over to visit Grace at her apartment. He brought with him a sketchbook, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for. It was a drawing of Grace mid-pose, arms outstretched as if caught in the middle of a graceful spin. "I figured you might like this," Leo said shyly, handing her the sketch. "You look kinda magical in it." Grace's eyes filled with tears as she studied the picture. "Thank you, Leo. This means more than you know." Leo shrugged, trying to play it cool but failing miserably. "No big deal. Just thought maybe it'd remind you of who you are." For a long moment, Grace simply gazed at the drawing, her fingers tracing the lines of the figure on the page. Finally, she looked up, her voice heavy with emotion. "I used to live for music," she confessed softly. "Every note, every movement, it was everything to me. Now, I just survive it." Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, echoing the truth she'd been too afraid to admit aloud. Yet even in her vulnerability, there was a glimmer of hope, a quiet determination to reclaim the pieces of herself she'd lost along the way. The days grew shorter as autumn settled over the town, painting the streets in hues of amber and crimson. Grace sat on her porch one afternoon, wrapped in a soft knit blanket, sipping tea that had long gone cold. Her mind wandered restlessly, replaying fragments of conversations she'd had with Jack, Leo, even Danny. Each memory tugged at her in different ways, Some brought warmth, others a sharp sting of regret. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires crunching against gravel. A bright yellow Volkswagen Beetle pulled into her driveway, and out stepped Emily Rivers, her best friend from rehab. Emily was everything Grace wasn't these days: bold, outspoken, and unapologetically herself. She bounded up the steps of the porch with an energy that seemed to fill the space around her. "Hey, stranger," Emily greeted, plopping down onto the chair beside Grace without waiting for an invitation. "You've been MIA lately. Thought I'd come check if you're still alive." Grace chuckled softly, though there was a hint of weariness in her smile. "I'm here. Just thinking too much, I guess." Emily raised an eyebrow, leaning forward with mock seriousness. "Thinking? That's dangerous. You know what they say, overthinking is the quickest way to ruin a perfectly good mood." "It's not funny, Em," Grace said quietly, staring down at her hands. "I feel like I'm stuck between two worlds. The person I used to be and this." She gestured vaguely toward her wheelchair. "Like no matter how hard I try, I can't bridge the gap." Emily's expression softened, and she reached out to squeeze Grace's hand. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. But hiding away isn't going to help either. You've got people who care about you, Grace. Let us in." Before Grace could respond, there was another visitor, a tall man in a dark suit, standing at the edge of her driveway. It was Pastor John, a familiar face in their small community. He approached slowly, his presence calming yet deliberate. "Grace," he said warmly, tipping his hat as he joined them on the porch. "Mind if I steal a moment?" Grace nodded, gesturing for him to sit. Emily excused herself discreetly, giving Grace a reassuring pat on the shoulder before heading inside. Pastor John took a deep breath, his kind eyes meeting hers. "I've been talking to Jack," he began gently. "He carries a lot of guilt, you know. About Rachel." Grace frowned, confused. "Rachel?" "The fire," Pastor John explained. "Jack blames himself for her death. He thinks he should have done more to save her. But the truth is, sometimes we can't change what happens. All we can do is forgive ourselves and move forward." Grace felt a pang of sympathy for Jack. She knew all too well how heavy the weight of guilt could be. "Does he talk about it often?" "Not enough," Pastor John admitted. "Which is why I wanted to share this with you. You understand pain, Grace. Maybe better than anyone else in his life right now. If anyone can help him heal, it's you." Grace looked away, overwhelmed by the responsibility implied in his words. Before she could dwell on it further, her phone buzzed on the table beside her. Picking it up, she saw an email notification from the local community center. Curious, she opened it and began to read. It was an invitation to teach a new dance class designed specifically for children of wounded veterans. The message was heartfelt, praising her past work and emphasizing the importance of helping these kids find joy and confidence through movement. Grace's heart raced as she scrolled through the details, but her excitement quickly gave way to doubt. "I can't," she murmured aloud, shaking her head. "What would they think when they see me? How can I teach anyone to dance when I can barely stand?" Pastor John placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Sometimes, Grace, it's not about showing people perfection. It's about showing them courage." Later that evening, Jack and Leo arrived at Grace's house bearing pizza and laughter. They'd made it a habit to stop by whenever they could, turning her quiet home into a place filled with warmth and light. As they ate together in the kitchen, Grace couldn't help but feel grateful for their presence. "So," Leo said between bites, eyeing her curiously. "What's this big decision you've been thinking about? Dad said you looked kinda stressed earlier." Grace hesitated, unsure how much to share. Finally, she sighed and pulled out her phone, showing them the email. "They want me to teach a dance class. For kids whose parents are veterans." Jack's eyes widened in surprise. That's incredible, Grace. Why are you hesitating? Because I'm scared, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. Scared of failing. Scared of being judged. Scared of letting them down. Leo tilted his head thoughtfully, his youthful innocence cutting straight to the heart of the matter. What if they need you to be brave first? He asked simply. The room fell silent as his words sank in. Grace stared at him, struck by the clarity of his perspective. In that moment, she realized he was right. These kids weren't looking for perfection, they were searching for connection, for hope. And maybe, just maybe, she could give them that. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as Grace wheeled herself into the brightly lit studio. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paint, a testament to its recent renovation. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting golden patterns across the floor. A group of children, ranging from ages 6 to 12, sat cross-legged on the mats, their eyes wide with curiosity, or perhaps apprehension, as they waited for their teacher. Grace took a deep breath, gripping the rims of her wheelchair tightly. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drumroll she couldn't silence. She had spent hours preparing for this moment, practicing what to say, how to position herself so she wouldn't feel exposed, but now that she was here, all her carefully rehearsed words felt hollow. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice softer than she intended. "My name is Grace, and I'll be your dance instructor." A little girl with braided pigtails raised her hand shyly. "Are you gonna teach us moves even though you're in a chair?" Grace hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. Then, forcing a smile, she nodded. "Absolutely. Dancing isn't about standing or sitting, it's about feeling the music and letting it move you. And today, we're going to start by learning how to dance with our hearts." For the next hour, Grace guided the children through simple movements, swaying arms, gentle spins, and rhythmic claps. At first, they were hesitant, glancing at each other uncertainly. But slowly, something shifted. Laughter bubbled up as one boy accidentally spun himself into a dizzy stumble, and soon the entire room was alive with motion. Watching them, Grace felt a flicker of the joy she'd once known, a spark she thought she'd lost forever. But just as she allowed herself to relax, the door burst open, and Maya stormed in. Her younger sister looked every bit the corporate powerhouse she'd become, sharp blazer, stiletto heels, and an expression colder than frost. She scanned the room with disdain before fixing her gaze on Grace. "What are you doing here?" Maya demanded, her tone cutting through the cheerful chaos like a knife. "You think teaching kids in some rundown center is going to fix you? Fix us?" Grace flinched visibly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. The children stopped moving, their laughter fading into uneasy silence. Jack, who had been observing quietly from the doorway, stepped forward instinctively, ready to intervene. But Grace held up a hand, silently asking him to stay back. "Maya," Grace said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "This isn't about fixing anything. It's about sharing something I love." Maya scoffed, crossing her arms. "Love? You gave up dancing years ago, Grace. Don't pretend this is about passion. It's guilt. Or worse, attention." Before Grace could respond, Danny appeared in the doorway, his usual scowl etched deeper than ever. He strode into the room, his sneakers squeaking against the floor. "Attention? That's rich coming from you," he sneered, pointing accusingly at Grace. "You don't belong here. You're not a dancer anymore, you're just faking it." The room seemed to freeze, the tension thick enough to choke on. Grace's hands clenched into fists in her lap, her knuckles white. For a moment, she considered walking out, letting the weight of their words crush her like so many times before. But then she looked around at the faces of the children, wide-eyed and confused, and realized she couldn't leave them hanging. "You're right," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I'm not the same person I used to be. But none of us are. Life changes us, that's part of being human. What matters is whether we let those changes define us, or inspire us to grow. Her words hung in the air, met with stunned silence. Maya rolled her eyes and turned on her heel, muttering something under her breath as she left. Danny lingered for a moment longer, glaring at Grace before storming out as well. When the door slammed shut behind him, the room erupted into whispers. Grace forced herself to smile, turning back to the children. "All right, let's finish strong," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "One last spin, okay?" As the class wrapped up, Jack approached her cautiously. "Hey," he said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did great in there." Grace shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "No, I didn't. I failed." "No, you didn't," he insisted firmly. "You showed those kids, and yourself, that you're stronger than you think. That takes courage." She wanted to believe him. She really did. But as she packed up her things and said goodbye to the children, the cracks in her resolve began to show. Back at home, she retreated to her bedroom, closing the door firmly behind her. Sliding down onto the floor beside her wheelchair, she buried her face in her hands and let the tears come. "Maybe I was never meant to come back," she whispered brokenly, her voice barely audible over the sound of her sobs. "Maybe I should have stayed gone." The days that followed were heavy with silence. Grace withdrew into herself, shutting out the world, and the people, who had tried so hard to pull her back from the edge. She cancelled her classes at the community center, ignored Jack's calls, and even turned away Emily when she came knocking one afternoon. It wasn't anger or spite that drove her isolation, it was shame. Shame for believing she could reclaim a piece of who she used to be, only to fall short once again. It had started innocently enough. After Maya and Danny's harsh words, Grace had resolved to prove them wrong, to show herself, if no one else, that she still had strength left in her. Late at night, after everyone else was asleep, she would lock herself in the living room and practice standing. At first, it was just gripping the back of a chair, willing her legs to hold her weight for a few seconds longer each time. But then, one fateful evening, she pushed too far. She remembered the moment vividly, the sharp pain shooting through her body as her knees buckled beneath her, sending her crashing to the floor. Her crutches clattered uselessly beside her, and tears streamed down her face, not from the physical ache, but from the crushing realization that she might never truly stand on her own again. After that, Grace stopped trying altogether. She spent most of her time in her bedroom, curtains drawn tight against the outside world. The vibrant sketches Leo had given her lay scattered across the dresser, their colors dulled by the dim light filtering through the cracks in the blinds. Even the thought of dancing felt foreign now, like a dream she'd once had but couldn't quite recall. One afternoon, as rain pattered softly against the windows, there was a faint rustling sound outside her door. A moment later, a folded sheet of paper slid underneath, stopping just shy of her wheelchair. Curious despite herself, Grace reached down to pick it up. Unfolding it, she found a drawing, her figure mid-pose, arms outstretched as if caught in flight. Beneath it, scrawled in Leo's messy handwriting, were the words, "You walk with your heart." Her breath hitched, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel something other than despair. It was small, fragile, a flicker of hope, but it was there. Later that week, Jack showed up unannounced, refusing to take no for an answer this time. He let himself in, carrying with him a weathered shoebox tied with twine. Sitting down on the couch opposite Grace, he placed the box gently on the coffee table between them. "I need you to hear this," he said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "These are letters I wrote to you over the years. Letters I never sent." Grace stared at him, startled. "Letters?" Jack nodded, opening the box and pulling out a stack of yellowed envelopes. "I didn't know where to send them after the accident. And honestly, I wasn't sure you'd want to hear from me. But now I think you need to know." He began reading aloud, his voice trembling slightly as he recounted memories of their youth, the way they used to dance together under the stars, how her laughter had always been his favorite sound. He spoke of the guilt he carried after losing touch with her, of the countless nights he'd lain awake wondering what might have been if he'd fought harder to stay in her life. "And then I saw you again," he continued, his gaze locking onto hers. "That day outside the church. You looked so broken, Grace. But I also saw the same fire in your eyes that I fell in love with all those years ago. Don't let anyone, or anything, take that away from you." By the time he finished, tears were streaming down Grace's face. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, holding it tightly as if afraid he might disappear. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The rain continued to patter against the windows, filling the silence with its soothing rhythm. Finally, Grace drew in a shaky breath and whispered, almost to herself, "I'm not done." Jack smiled faintly, squeezing her hand. "Good. Because neither am I." The community center buzzed with quiet anticipation as Grace wheeled herself into the studio once again. It had been weeks since she'd last set foot, or rather, wheel, inside, and the children greeted her with a mix of excitement and relief. Their faces lit up at the sight of her, though some hesitated, unsure if she was truly here to stay this time. Grace took a deep breath, forcing a smile that felt both fragile and determined. "All right, everyone," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Today, we're going to try something new." She positioned herself in front of the group, gripping the edge of her wheelchair tightly. For a moment, she closed her eyes, focusing on the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Then, slowly, she pushed herself upward, leaning heavily on crutches tucked beneath her arms. Her legs trembled violently, threatening to give way, but she held firm, taking one small, halting step forward. The room fell silent. Even the youngest child seemed to sense the gravity of what they were witnessing, a woman who had spent years believing she could never stand again, defying every limit placed upon her. Tears pricked at Grace's eyes, but she didn't stop. She forced herself to take another step, then another, until she stood fully upright for the first time in years. "I know it's hard," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But sometimes, the hardest steps are the ones that matter most." As the class erupted into applause, Grace allowed herself a brief moment of triumph before sinking back into her chair, exhausted but elated. She glanced around the room, meeting each child's gaze with a warmth that made them feel seen, valued, and capable of anything. Unbeknownst to Grace, Danny lingered just outside the doorway, watching silently from the shadows. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or admiration. He hadn't planned to come back, part of him still resented Grace for abandoning the dance program all those years ago. But seeing her now, vulnerable yet unyielding, stirred emotions he hadn't realized he'd buried. Later that evening, as Danny sat alone in his dimly lit bedroom, memories began to surface, memories he'd tried so desperately to suppress. He thought about his younger sister, Lily, who had idolized Grace when she was a student in her class. After the program shut down following Grace's accident, Lily had spiraled. She'd started skipping school, acting out, and eventually gotten behind the wheel drunk one fateful night. The crash had killed her instantly, leaving Danny shattered and angry, at the world, at himself, and especially at Grace. But now, as he replayed the image of Grace standing tall despite her pain, a seed of understanding began to grow within him. Maybe she wasn't the villain he'd made her out to be. Maybe they were more alike than he cared to admit, both broken, both trying to find their way back to who they used to be. That night, Jack came over to check on Grace. They sat together on her porch, the cool evening air wrapping around them like a comforting embrace. Neither spoke for a long while, content simply to share the silence. Finally, Jack broke it. "Do you remember the last time we danced?" he asked, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. Grace chuckled softly, shaking her head. "How could I forget? You stepped on my toes so many times, I thought I'd need surgery. Jack laughed, scratching the back of his neck sheepishly. Hey, in my defense, you were moving too fast for me to keep up. Well, Grace said, turning to face him, maybe it's time we gave it another shot. Without waiting for a response, she reached out, placing one hand on his shoulder while the other clasped his firmly. Jack hesitated for only a moment before resting his free hand lightly on her waist. Together, they began to sway, their movements slow and imperfect but undeniably real. At first, Grace relied heavily on Jack for support, her body stiff with uncertainty. But as the music swelled, a soft melody drifting through the open window, she relaxed into the rhythm, letting it guide her. There were no fancy spins or intricate steps, just two people holding onto each other, finding balance in shared vulnerability. You're not dancing like before, Jack murmured after a while, his voice low and tender. You're dancing like now. Grace looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. I think I like this version better. The evening had started like any other, a quiet hum of activity filled the community center as Grace wrapped up her dance class. The children were laughing, their energy infectious, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Grace felt a sense of peace settle over her. But that peace was shattered when a sharp crackling sound echoed through the building, followed by the unmistakable smell of smoke. At first, no one paid much attention, thinking it might just be something burning in the kitchen. But then came the shouts, panicked and urgent, from down the hall. Fire! Everyone out! Grace's heart leapt into her throat as chaos erupted around her. Parents scrambled to grab their kids, while others rushed toward the exits, coughing against the thickening haze filling the air. She wheeled herself quickly to the center of the room, raising her voice above the commotion. All right, everyone, stay calm. Follow me, we'll go out the side door. Her mind raced, memories of her own accident flooding back, the heat, the panic, the feeling of helplessness. For a moment, she froze, her hands gripping the rims of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then she shook herself, forcing those thoughts aside. This wasn't about her, it was about keeping these children safe. Jack burst into the room moments later, his face streaked with soot but his expression resolute. Grace, he called, spotting her immediately. We've got to get everyone out. There's flames spreading fast. I'm on it, she replied, already directing the remaining kids toward the exit. Take the ones who can move quickly, I'll handle the rest. As Jack ushered a group outside, Grace stayed behind, helping a young boy who had fallen and twisted his ankle. She positioned herself beside him, offering words of encouragement as they moved slowly toward safety. By the time they reached the fresh air, sirens wailed in the distance, and firefighters were arriving on scene. But even amidst the controlled evacuation, tension simmered among the crowd. Whispers spread like wildfire, not about the fire itself, but about how it had started. Someone mentioned seeing Danny near the storage closet earlier, where the blaze seemed to have originated. Accusations flew, and soon all eyes turned toward him. Danny stood off to the side, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched. He avoided looking at anyone, his guilt written plainly across his face. When Grace approached him cautiously, he flinched, bracing himself for another verbal attack. Danny, she said softly, her tone measured but not unkind. What happened? He hesitated, his shoulders slumping under the weight of shame. Finally, he muttered, I didn't mean to, I swear. I was angry, okay? Angry at you, at everything. I threw a match into the trash bin, thinking maybe it'd scare people away from this stupid place. His voice cracked, tears welling in his eyes. But I never thought it would spread like that. Grace exhaled sharply, her stomach churning with conflicting emotions, anger, fear, pity. Yet somehow, she managed to keep her composure. Kneeling beside him, she placed a gentle hand on his arm. You made a mistake, Danny. A big one. But running away won't fix it. You need to take responsibility. Before Danny could respond, Jack appeared beside them, favoring one leg slightly. He'd injured himself during the evacuation, but his focus remained entirely on the situation at hand. Is he all right? Jack asked, nodding toward Danny. Grace nodded. He will be. He's going to tell the truth. Danny looked between them, his expression torn. Slowly, he stood, wiping his face with the sleeve of his hoodie. Okay, he whispered hoarsely. I'll tell them. I'll own up to it. As Danny walked toward the waiting authorities, Grace watched him go, her heart heavy yet hopeful. She knew redemption wouldn't come easily, not for him, or for herself, but she also knew that facing the past was the only way forward. The days following the fire were heavy with tension, each moment stretching like taffy under the weight of unspoken truths. Grace sat alone on her porch one evening, staring out at the horizon as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold. She couldn't shake the image of Danny's face, his guilt, his fear, as he confessed to starting the fire. It reminded her too much of herself, of the secrets she'd carried for years, buried deep beneath layers of regret. Jack found her there, leaning against the railing with a cup of coffee in hand. He hesitated before speaking, his voice soft but tinged with unease. Can we talk? Grace glanced up, nodding faintly. Of course. He sat down beside her, his posture stiff as if bracing himself for something painful. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply gazing out at the fading light. Then, finally, he began. The fire that killed Rachel. His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat before continuing. It wasn't just an accident. I was supposed to be watching her, it was my job to keep her safe. But I got distracted. By work, by everything. And when the flames started, I froze. If I'd acted faster, maybe she'd still be here. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She'd known Jack carried guilt over Rachel's death, but hearing him say it aloud broke her heart in ways she hadn't expected. Reaching out, she placed a gentle hand on his arm. You can't blame yourself forever, Jack. You were human. We all make mistakes. Do we? He asked bitterly. Because sometimes it feels like those mistakes define us. Like they're all anyone sees. Before Grace could respond, she felt the lump in her own throat grow heavier. The words she'd kept locked away for so long suddenly demanded to be spoken. Taking a shaky breath, she whispered, I didn't just leave you after high school, Jack. I was pregnant. Jack froze, his eyes widening in shock. What? I lost the baby after the crash, she continued, her voice trembling. I thought, if I stayed, you'd see me as broken. Damaged. So I ran. Not because I didn't love you, but because I didn't know how to face what I'd become. Silence settled between them, thick and suffocating. Jack stared at her, his expression a mix of pain and understanding. Slowly, he reached out, taking her hand in his. Grace, I would have stood by you. No matter what. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she squeezed his hand tightly. I know that now. But back then, I didn't believe anyone could ever look at me the same way again. Meanwhile, Danny faced juvenile court, his fate hanging precariously in the balance. Grace attended the hearing, sitting in the front row as a silent show of support. When called to speak, she rose slowly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. Your Honor, she began, addressing the judge directly. Danny made a terrible mistake, one that could have cost lives. But he's also a kid who's been carrying the weight of loss and anger for far too long. He deserves a chance to make things right. Maya, who had unexpectedly stepped in to defend Danny pro bono, nodded approvingly from her seat at the defense table. Her sharp suit and polished demeanor contrasted sharply with the raw vulnerability in her eyes. My client has already taken responsibility for his actions, she added firmly. And he's committed to making amends. Rehabilitation, not punishment, is what he needs. The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he sighed deeply. Very well. Community service and mandatory counseling. But let this be a lesson, young man, you're fortunate to have people willing to fight for you. As the gavel fell, Grace exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Outside the courthouse, Maya approached her cautiously, her usual bravado softened by gratitude. Thank you, she said simply. For standing up for him. For believing in him. Grace smiled faintly. He's worth fighting for, Maya. Just like you were once. Maya's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment, the wall between them seemed to crumble. They weren't sisters anymore, at least, not in the traditional sense, but perhaps they could find their way back to each other. That night, Grace returned home to find Jack waiting for her on the porch. He handed her a steaming mug of tea, his gaze warm and unwavering. How'd it go? As well as it could, she replied, sitting down beside him. Danny will be okay. He'll have to work hard, but he'll get through this. Jack nodded thoughtfully. We all will. The past doesn't have to bury you, Grace. Sometimes, it's how you grow. Grace looked at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and determination. Yeah, she murmured softly. Maybe it is. The morning air was crisp and cool, carrying with it the faint scent of autumn leaves. Grace stood at the edge of her driveway, her crutches tucked securely beneath her arms. Ahead of her loomed the willow tree, a quiet sentinel that had witnessed so many of her struggles and triumphs over the years. It was a place she'd avoided for so long, its branches heavy with memories both sweet and painful. But today felt different. Today, she was ready. Taking a deep breath, Grace stepped forward, her legs trembling but holding firm. Each step was deliberate, slow, and achingly difficult, yet she refused to stop. She focused on the rhythm of her breathing, the steady beat of her heart, and the knowledge that Jack and Leo were watching from the porch behind her. Their presence gave her strength, anchoring her to the moment. When she finally reached the tree, she leaned against its sturdy trunk, closing her eyes as a wave of emotion washed over her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel not just the weight of what she'd lost, but the joy of what she'd found again. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of gratitude, of hope, of rebirth. From the porch, Leo turned to his father, awe shining in his wide eyes. Dad, is she walking? Jack nodded, his own vision blurred by tears. Yeah, buddy. She's walking. Leo grinned, bouncing excitedly on his toes. That's amazing. Can we go hug her? Jack chuckled softly, ruffling his son's hair. Let's give her a minute, okay? This is her moment. But Grace must have sensed their eagerness, because she turned around, her smile radiant despite the tears streaking her cheeks. With measured steps, she made her way back toward them, each movement a testament to her resilience. When she finally reached the porch, Jack pulled her into a tight embrace, lifting her slightly off the ground as if to shield her from any harm that might ever come her way. I'm so proud of you, he whispered against her ear, his voice thick with emotion. Grace clung to him, laughing through her tears. I couldn't have done it without you. As they pulled apart, Leo threw his arms around her waist, nearly knocking her off balance. You're like a superhero, he exclaimed, beaming up at her. Can I be your sidekick? Grace laughed, crouching down to meet his gaze. You already are, kiddo. Later that week, Grace unveiled her newest project, Step Forward Dance Company, a dance academy designed specifically for children and teens who had faced adversity, whether through illness, injury, or personal hardship. The studio was small but vibrant, its walls adorned with colorful murals painted by local artists. Sunlight poured through large windows, illuminating the polished wooden floors where dreams would soon take flight. On opening day, the room buzzed with excitement as parents and students filed in, eager to see what Grace had created. She stood at the front of the studio, her wheelchair parked nearby as a reminder of how far she'd come. As she addressed the crowd, her voice rang out clear and confident. "This isn't just about dancing," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "It's about finding your strength, your courage, and your voice, even when the world tries to silence you. Here, no one is broken. No one is less than. You are all exactly who you're meant to be." Applause erupted, filling the space with warmth and energy. Jack watched from the sidelines, pride swelling in his chest as he saw the woman Grace had become, not just a survivor, but a beacon of hope for others. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed and the room grew quieter, Jack approached her, his hands stuffed casually into his pockets. "You know," he began, a playful smirk tugging at his lips, "I think this calls for a celebration." "Oh yeah?" Grace teased, raising an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" Without waiting for a response, Jack leaned in, brushing his lips gently against hers. The kiss was soft and tentative at first, as if testing the waters of something long forgotten. But when Grace responded, leaning into him with a sigh of contentment, it deepened, becoming a promise of everything they'd fought so hard to reclaim. When they finally pulled apart, Grace rested her forehead against his, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Took you long enough," she murmured, her voice teasing but tender. Jack laughed, pressing another quick kiss to her lips. "Better late than never, right?" That night, as they sat together on the couch, Leo sprawled across Grace's lap while Jack flipped through channels on the TV, the boy suddenly piped up, his tone curious but serious. "So, is she my real mom now?" Grace froze, startled by the question. Beside her, Jack chuckled softly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "She doesn't have to be your real mom, buddy," he said gently. "But if she wants to be, I think we'd all be pretty lucky." Leo tilted his head thoughtfully, then grinned. "Cool. Because superheroes should totally be moms." Grace laughed, pulling him closer for a hug. "Deal," she said, her voice warm and full of love. "Superhero mom sounds perfect." The willow tree stood tall and serene, its branches swaying gently in the breeze as golden sunlight filtered through the leaves. It was here, beneath this very tree, that Grace had taken her first steps toward healing, both physically and emotionally. And now, it would bear witness to yet another monumental moment in her life. Jack knelt on one knee before her, his expression a mix of nervousness and unwavering devotion. In his hand, he held a simple silver ring, its understated elegance mirroring the depth of their love. "Grace," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion welling in his eyes, "you've taught me what it means to truly live, not just survive. You've shown me that even after the hardest storms, there's beauty waiting on the other side. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks as she nodded, her voice catching in her throat. "Yes," she whispered, her hands trembling as Jack slid the ring onto her finger. "1,000 times yes." Weeks later, the day of the wedding arrived. The ceremony was intimate, held under the same willow tree where Jack had proposed. A soft breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, mingling with the faint hum of crickets hidden in the grass. Strings of twinkling fairy lights were draped between the branches, casting a warm, ethereal glow over the gathering. Grace stood at the edge of the makeshift aisle, her heart swelling with gratitude as she looked at Leo beside her. He wore a miniature suit that matched Jack's, his tie slightly askew but his grin impossibly wide. "Ready?" he asked, offering her his arm like a true gentleman. "More than ever," Grace replied, her voice thick with emotion. Together, they began their slow procession down the aisle, each step a testament to how far they'd come, not just individually, but as a family. At the end of the aisle stood Jack, his gaze locked onto Grace with such intensity it made her breath catch. Beside him, Pastor John smiled warmly, ready to officiate the sacred union. Danny sat quietly among the guests, his usual scowl softened into something resembling peace. Emily, ever the vivacious spirit, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while Maya, looking surprisingly elegant in a floral dress, presented Grace with a bouquet of sunflowers and baby's breath moments before the ceremony began. As Grace reached Jack, Leo stepped back, beaming proudly as if to say, "This is my doing." Jack took her hands in his touch firm yet tender. "You look beautiful," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "So do you," Grace teased softly, earning a chuckle from the small crowd. The vows they exchanged were simple but profound, filled with promises not just of love, but of resilience and partnership. They spoke of the storms they'd weathered together, the guilt, the grief, the fear, and how those challenges had only strengthened their bond. When Pastor John pronounced them husband and wife, Jack pulled Grace into a kiss that was equal parts tender and triumphant, drawing cheers and applause from their loved ones. Afterward, as the group gathered around a bonfire for a cozy reception, laughter and music filled the air. Danny lingered near the edge of the firelight, watching silently until Grace approached him with an open smile. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "It means more than I can say." Danny shrugged, though there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "I couldn't miss it. Not after everything." Grace reached out, squeezing his shoulder lightly. "You're part of this family now, Danny. Whether you like it or not." He smirked, rolling his eyes good-naturedly. Yeah. Don't get all mushy on me." Nearby, Leo sat cross-legged on a picnic blanket, gazing up at the stars with a dreamy expression. When Grace and Jack joined him, he leaned against Grace's side, resting his head on her shoulder. "This is what love looks like after the storm," he said thoughtfully, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone far older than his years. Grace and Jack exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling with pride and affection for the boy who had become the glue holding their fractured pieces together. "You're right, kiddo," Jack said, ruffling Leo's hair. "This is exactly what it looks like." The morning sun cast long shadows across the park as Grace practiced her steps on the grass, her crutches resting nearby. The ground was uneven, and though she had grown stronger in recent months, walking without assistance still required immense focus and courage. Each step felt like a victory, yet each wobble reminded her of how fragile progress could be. She took another cautious step, her legs trembling beneath her. But this time, her foot caught on a patch of loose dirt, and she stumbled, falling hard onto the soft earth. For a moment, she stayed there, her palms pressed against the cool grass, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. It wasn't just the physical pain that stung, it was the frustration, the fear that maybe she'd never truly escape the limitations of her body. Before she could sink too deeply into despair, familiar voices called out to her. Jack, Leo, and Danny rushed over, their faces etched with concern but also determination. Jack knelt beside her, offering his hand. "Grace," he said gently, "you don't have to do this alone." Leo crouched down on her other side, his small hands gripping hers tightly. "Come on, Mom," he urged, using the title for the first time since their wedding. "You've got this." Even Danny, who usually kept his distance, reached out hesitantly, his voice softer than usual. "Let us help you up." For a heartbeat, Grace hesitated, her pride warring with her need. Then, slowly, she nodded, allowing them to lift her back onto her feet. She leaned heavily on Jack's shoulder for support, her breaths coming in shaky gasps. When she finally found her balance again, she looked at each of them, her husband, her son, the boy who had once resented her, and smiled through her tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Later that week, the town came together in an extraordinary display of unity. A fundraiser was organized to rebuild the community center destroyed by the fire, and nearly everyone turned out to support the cause. Booths lined the streets, selling homemade goods and crafts, while local bands played lively music to keep spirits high. Children ran between tables, laughing and clutching balloons, while adults exchanged stories of hope and resilience. Grace stood near the stage set up in the center of the square, watching the festivities with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Maya approached her, carrying a clipboard filled with donation forms. "Looks like we're going to raise enough to rebuild," she announced, her tone lighter than usual. "Maybe even add a second floor." Grace smiled, reaching out to squeeze her sister's arm. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Maya. Thank you, for believing in me." Maya shrugged, though there was a hint of warmth in her eyes. "Believe it or not, I've always believed in you, sis. You're just too stubborn to admit when you're amazing." As night fell, the crowd gathered around the stage for one final surprise. Grace stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. This was something she hadn't planned, a solo performance to close the evening. She didn't know if she was ready, but deep down, she knew it was what she needed to do, not just for herself, but for everyone who had supported her journey. The music began softly, a haunting melody that seemed to echo the highs and lows of her life. At first, Grace hesitated, her movements tentative and unsure. Her legs faltered, and for a moment, it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. But then, with sheer willpower, she pushed forward, letting the rhythm guide her. Her dance wasn't perfect, it was raw, emotional, and achingly human. Tears streamed down her face as she spun and swayed, her body telling a story words never could. When the final note faded, the crowd erupted into applause, cheering and whistling as if they'd witnessed something miraculous. And perhaps they had. Grace stood there, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling with the weight of everything she'd overcome. Jack, Leo, and Danny stood at the edge of the stage, clapping louder than anyone else, their faces glowing with pride. As Grace descended from the stage, Jack pulled her into a tight embrace. "That was incredible," he murmured against her ear. "Not because it was flawless, but because it was real." Grace nodded, leaning into him. "Real is all I've ever wanted to be." Nearby, Leo tugged on her sleeve, his eyes wide with admiration. "Mom," he said earnestly, "that's what strength looks like, isn't it? Not never falling, just choosing to rise." Grace knelt down to meet his gaze, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Exactly, sweetheart. Strength isn't about never falling, it's about choosing to rise. Every single time." 1 year later, the rebuilt community center buzzed with life. The once empty studio now overflowed with laughter and energy as Grace moved among her students, her crutches leaning against the wall nearby. Her class was a vibrant mix of abilities. Some children danced on 2 feet, others used wheelchairs or walkers, and a few sat quietly, swaying their arms to the rhythm. It didn't matter how they moved, what mattered was that they were moving together, united by the joy of expression. Grace stood at the front of the room, her voice warm and encouraging. "Remember," she said with a smile, "dancing isn't about perfection, it's about connection. Let the music guide you." As the kids twirled and spun, their laughter filling the air, Grace glanced toward the doorway. There stood Jack, leaning casually against the frame, his arms crossed as he watched her with quiet pride. Beside him, Leo clutched a brightly colored book in his hands, its cover emblazoned with bold letters, "Miss Grace Walks with Her Heart." He waved excitedly when he caught Grace's eye, mouthing, "Wait till you see it." After the class ended, Grace wheeled herself over to them, her cheeks flushed from exertion but her eyes sparkling with happiness. "So?" she asked, nodding toward the book in Leo's hands. "What's this I hear about my very own author?" Leo grinned, holding up the book proudly. "It's about you, Mom." "Well, kind of. It's about how you taught me, and everyone, that walking doesn't just mean using your legs. Sometimes, it means finding your way back to who you're supposed to be." Grace blinked back tears, pulling him into a tight hug. "I think I'm going to need a copy of that." Jack chuckled, ruffling Leo's hair affectionately. "You'll have to fight the fans for one. This kid's already got a signing tour lined up at school." Later that evening, the three of them sat together on the porch, the autumn breeze carrying the scent of fallen leaves. Jack leaned back in his chair, gazing out at the horizon as the sun dipped below the trees. His voice grew thoughtful, almost reverent, as he began to speak. Some people think stories end with a kiss, he mused aloud, glancing at Grace with a tender smile. But ours? Ours began there. That day under the willow tree wasn't an ending, it was the start of something bigger than either of us could have imagined. Grace rested her head on his shoulder, her fingers intertwined with his. It's funny, isn't it? How much can change in just a year? Jack nodded, his gaze softening. And not just for us. Look at Leo, he's writing books now. And Danny, he's volunteering at the center, helping kids who remind him of himself. Even Maya's starting to soften around the edges. Leo perked up at the mention of his name, flipping through the pages of his book. Yeah, but none of that would have happened if you hadn't decided to keep going, Mom. You showed us all that being broken doesn't mean you're done. Grace smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his face. We're all works in progress, kiddo. Every step forward counts, even the messy ones. As the sky darkened, stars began to peek through the twilight, casting a gentle glow over the world below. Jack leaned forward slightly, his tone shifting to something deeper, more universal. You know, I used to think strength meant never falling. But watching you, Grace, I've learned something else. Strength is choosing to rise. Over and over again, no matter how hard it gets. Grace met his gaze, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. And sometimes, she added softly, it's letting others help you stand. The camera lingered on their faces, Jack's steady resolve, Grace's quiet determination, and Leo's boundless optimism, as the screen faded to black. Words appeared in white text against the darkness, simple yet profound. You are never too broken to begin again. At its heart, this story is about resilience, the kind that doesn't come from never falling but from choosing to rise every time you do. Grace's journey reminds us that life's greatest challenges often become the stepping stones to our most profound growth. Her courage to walk again, both literally and metaphorically, teaches us that healing isn't linear. It's messy, imperfect, and sometimes painful, but it's always worth it. We also learn that no one heals alone. Jack, Leo, Danny, Maya, and even the community came together to support Grace in ways she couldn't have imagined at her lowest points. Their collective strength shows us the power of connection and compassion, proving that we're stronger when we lean on each other. But perhaps the most important takeaway is this: you are never too broken to begin again. No matter how far you've fallen or how lost you feel, there's always a chance to rebuild, not just your life, but your spirit. Grace didn't just find her footing, she found purpose, love, and a legacy that will inspire generations to come. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Every week, we bring you heartfelt tales like this one, stories of hope, redemption, and the beauty of the human spirit. By joining our community, you won't miss out on the next chapter of inspiration, where ordinary people discover extraordinary strength. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How did Grace's journey impact you? What moment stood out to you the most? Your voice matters, and together, we can keep these conversations alive. Reflections and opinions. This narrative has struck a chord with many viewers because it mirrors real-life struggles so authentically. Grace's battle with self-doubt, her fear of judgment, and her eventual triumph over adversity reflect universal truths about the human condition. The inclusion of characters like Danny and Maya adds depth, showing that everyone carries scars, visible or not, and that forgiveness, of ourselves and others, is key to moving forward. One viewer commented, "Grace's story reminded me of my own mother, who fought to rebuild her life after an accident. Seeing her dance at the end brought tears to my eyes. It felt like a victory for anyone who's ever been told they're not enough." Another wrote, "I loved how Leo's innocence tied everything together. His question, 'Is she my real mom now?' hit me right in the feels. Family isn't just blood, it's the people who stand by you." What makes this story timeless is its message of hope. It tells us that while life may knock us down, it's up to us to decide whether we stay there or take another step forward. And sometimes, that single step changes everything. So, what's your next step going to be? Let us know, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us all of the power of second chances.